Hello, everyone. My name is Jimmy Casas, and I am the best-selling author of the book Culturize, Every Student, Every Day, Whatever It Takes. And I am fired up because I'm here today with my co-author and good friend, Cale Burke. And we're going to talk a little bit about not just about Culturize, but more important, we're going to be talking about words on the wall. Say, hey, listen, I am blessed because I know about 7 years ago, I wrote Culturize. And I never imagined in my life that that book would do as good as it's done. And I'm just so grateful and so blessed, and I never take it for granted. And I wrote Culturize because honestly, it was just a story, but it was a story about me and my struggles, right? And the truth of the matter is that when we began to think about culture and school culture, the impact that we all want to make and that we do make in our organizations today, I realized that I wasn't making the impact that I wanted to make. And when we talk about culture, I started recognizing that I wasn't focusing on who I wanted to be as a leader, but more importantly, I wasn't even thinking about who I just wanted to be as an individual in every arena of my life. And so Culturize is actually a behavior framework. I wrote the book for myself. It was a behavior framework for me to remind me who I always wanted to be as an educator. So those 4 core principles of what it means to truly be a champion for students, what it truly means to expect excellence, to carry the banner, to be a merchant of hope, is really a behavior framework for me. So I make sure that every day I'm doing the very best I can to live my excellence. And although it's not about perfection, it's always about growth and continue to evolve in the work that we do each and every day. It does hold me accountable to be who I want to be. But as I began to do more work with schools, and again, for people who would share with me, Jimmy, I love Culturize, and I really love everything it stands for, and I love the principles. But sometimes I go in the classroom, and I'm not sure exactly how to use Culturize in the classroom, right? And it got me thinking about, what would that look like? And people would say to me, are you going to write Culturize too? I'm like, I don't really want to write Culturize too. I want it to be something different, more impactful, something that would really take it to another level. And so this past weekend, I had the opportunity, or this past week, I should say, I had the opportunity, I was doing a conference, and this idea came up of what does it mean to be a champion for students, right? So if I were to walk into a classroom and I were to watch a teacher for a second, what would they be doing that would show me that they were truly being a champion for students? And more importantly, what would it lead to? So I went up to this table of 8, Cale, and I went up there and I asked all these 8 individuals, hey, so if I walk in your classroom, what does it look like? Or what would you see? What would you observe that teachers were being champion for students? And as I handed the microphone around, one of the things I quickly learned is they all said something different, which is really interesting. And I remember saying to the room, what is your takeaway from what you just heard? And right away, somebody said that they all said something different. Exactly. And so I guess my question that I pose to you today as a listener is, if I were to walk into your school, if I were to walk into your classroom, what would I observe to tell me that people are actually living the words on the wall, whatever our words are? If our words say kindness, if our words say excellence, if our words say inclusion, the big question is, are we actually living those words on the wall? In other words, does the behavior of the adults in the organization mirror the words on the wall? So I have my good friend and co-author Cale Burke here today because I give credit to Cale here, and here's why. Because Cale and I met literally just a couple years ago, and in my interactions with him, he was asking me all these questions about Culturize, and he started pushing my thinking on it. And when he started pushing my thinking, I knew right away he was right. Like, what would these things actually lead to? And so then we began to have more conversations and more conversations. And eventually, here we are about 2.5 years later. And this is the creation of that initial conversation, Cale Burke. So thank you so much, my dear friend. And so Cale, welcome.
Thank you very much. This is super exciting to listen in and be a part of it, and for us to have been able to connect has been it's been a great adventure so far.
Well, thank you, my friend. So Cale, what I want you to do today, if you wouldn't mind, just you had this vision when you first shared this with me. You and I started getting this conversation. So one of the things I loved about you is you really push my thinking. I love the way you reflect. I love the things you talk about. And this whole work around observable impact. Can you share with our audience today a little bit talk to me about where does this come from? What are your thoughts behind this? And what have you learned over the past year as you and I have written this book and more importantly, in the work you're doing with schools today? Talk to me about the impact you're seeing about words on the wall.
Well, interestingly, where observable impact started was really around collaborative time and PLCs years ago. And one of the things that I was struggling with as a school leader was that we were doing all this work around collaborating, and we were saying we were collaborating, and we were saying that we were PLCs, and we had our vision and mission and all that sort of stuff. And what I started to realize was that for all the work that our hardworking adults were doing in the building, what was the actual impact that it was having on kids? And so that's where I really started to dig into this idea and come up with this thought of how do we really simplify impact? And it dawned upon me, well, actually our evidence of impact is what we see in the classroom from our students. And so that's where the idea came from. And then of course, years ago when I read your book, I was thinking along those same lines. So this is interesting. Like if I was truly, being a champion for students, what would that look like in the classroom? But then it struck me that very frequently we talk about our actions as adults, and everyone's working hard. I don't think that we can work harder than we do today. Our teachers are working hard, our leaders, our superintendents at every level of the system. We're all working hard, but in truth, which of our actions are leading to impact? And so when we take something like champion for students or expecting excellence or any of the core principles, the wonder I started to think about is if we were doing all these things at the highest level, what would it lead to in our students? I think a lot of times when we go into classrooms, I think you'll agree, Jimmy, we've all observed classrooms, and we go in and a lot of times we look at sort of what the teacher's doing, and we look at the things that they're doing in the classrooms, the activities, the assessments. But what I started to think more and more about but if we were doing all these things really well, what would it lead to for kids, which is what you mentioned earlier? And that's really where when you and I started to get together on this a couple of years ago, was really both pushing both of our thinking to think, I wonder how we could make those 4 core principles really come to life for people. In other words, if I were truly being a champion for students, what would it lead to in our kids? What would they actually be doing and demonstrating in a classroom that said that I'm being a champion for students? And remember, Jimmy, I remember I think we were in cars talking, and we started really fleshing out this idea. And when you think about it, it's pretty easy for us to say, I am a champion for students. I do carry the banner for students. And we mean that in the best of intentions. But what you just highlighted was when you talked to 8 different groups or 8 different people, and they all had 8 different answers for what that actually looked like. It made both of us realize that we actually need to help people granularize what specifically would we observe that says we are a champion for students. And one of the things that we talk about now, and we talk about this, of course, in the book, is does it pass what we call the teenager test? I have teenage daughters, 16 and 14. In fact, one of my daughters is celebrating her birthday today. And what's really interesting is if I were to say to my daughter, hey, you need to be resilient, my daughter would turn around and say, but Dad, I am resilient. Yet if I said to her, you need to be resilient, and what resilient looks like is you would make multiple attempts and use multiple strategies before you ask Dad where your phone was, she would go, okay, no, I'm not resilient. And if we start to take resilience out and put champion for students in, the question becomes, if we were truly being a champion for students, what would we actually observe? What would we actually see? And this becomes different because if we think about the idea of being a champion for students, it's really about understanding their story. So it's great when we ask educators, and I was just with some educators last week in the southern US, and it was really interesting to listen to them think about this idea that, wait a minute, if we were really truly being a champion for students and really understanding their stories, what would we observe from them? And it was pretty neat what they started to come up with, because what they came up with was things like, we would hear our students telling their unique stories about their context. And that's different because now this passes the teenager test. In other words, where we start to go, I'm being a champion for students. And I know I'm a champion for students when I can hear each of my students willing to share their unique stories about their context. Now we've put that nice descriptive qualifier on there. And I think what that does is it allows those 8 groups that you had, for example, to start to really hone in on what are a couple of things that we would observe that would tell us that I am a champion for students, that I am carrying the banner for our students. And when we start with the students first, I think personally, it guides us to start to think about if that's what we want to see from each student. And I love each student, Jimmy. I really like that. Sometimes we say all students and it's kind of big. But when we say each student, it's very different because I know in reading Culturize, you talked about your own individual experiences. I think it's critical that when we start to really paint the picture of what each of the core principles would look like in the classroom, we think about each student. And now if we say, if we want each student to be able to share their unique stories about their individual context, now that takes us as teachers into a mind frame where we start to go, I wonder how we would get each of our students to do that. We'd have to create safe spaces and give kids multiple opportunities and multiple modalities to share their unique thoughts, ideas, and context. That's interesting. And that to me starts to drive the instruction that we have in the classroom. And I think by starting at the core with what it is that we would actually observe from students and then using that to guide our actions, I think truly we can start to engineer our vision of what the words on the wall actually lead to in the classroom in those core principles. And I think you'd agree, one of the things we wanted to do in the book was not tell people this is what it should look like for you. We gave examples in the book, didn't we? So that people could say, that's interesting because every school is at a different place. Every school has different elements. But what I do notice, and I think you've seen this too, Jimmy, is everywhere I travel, whether it's Asia or New Zealand or here in Canada or in the US, everyone's working on culture. But if every one of us has a different definition of what our 4 core principles lead to, it becomes really hard to work on. So I think that's really what's coalesced for us together in the book, is not to tell people this is what you should do, but rather here's a framework for you to start with. Consider what you'd observe from students first, then think about educators, the types of tasks and assessments in a classroom, and then what leaders would do as well. And that really was the driver for Words on the Wall, wasn't it?
Yeah, I like the idea when you say what we want them to do. We're not trying to tell people what to do. It's more like reflect on who do you want to be? What's the impact you're trying to make in the classroom, right? And you and I have discussed this a lot, Kale, in the sense of everybody's working on culture, and that's truth. But at the end of the day, as we talk about a lot in the book, but it's the adults who cause the culture, right? I mean, right now, this country spends a lot of money on all sorts of programs for children's behavior. But at the end of the day, where's the framework for the adult behavior? I believe we're the ones that cause the culture. And you actually even used the example before we got on air. You were just talking about safety. You were sharing some story about, if students were to be safe in school. We want our children to be safe in school. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? How you said, well, what would that look like, right? So if I walked in and said, if I had a classroom that was safe, what would I observe? What would I see? You want to talk about that a little bit? Because I really like that example too, because that's part of culture and climate, right? Where kids feel they have a voice and they feel like they belong and they feel like they're connected. But what does that look like if I walk into a classroom? Student engagement is another one. I hear this all the time. We're working on student engagement. I know, but if I walk into a classroom, what am I seeing that shows me the kids are actually engaged in their learning, and what is that actually leading to? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I want to start with just what you said about engagement first, and I'll come back to safety. And engagement is so big, isn't it? And I know that lots of people are talking about student engagement and cell phones and all these different things, and how can we possibly engage students? And I think when we have something so big as engagement, we have to start to break that down in such a way that it gets down to what it is that we would actually see. It's interesting, though, because when schools sometimes say we're working on engagement, I always scratch my head a little bit because it's sort of like, and I keep using my daughters, I'm sure they're going to be wild after they see this video. But if I said to if my daughter came to me and said, you know what, Dad, I'm really struggling with math, I can't help her with that because math is too big. There's too much. But if my daughter said to me, Dad, I'm really struggling with adding and subtracting fractions. I'm okay with multiplying fractions, but when it comes to adding and subtracting fractions, I struggle with finding a common denominator. Well, now all of a sudden it tells me a couple things. Number one, that my daughter is actually doing the work. She's really started to think more and more about what's my real challenge here in math. And the second thing is it allows me to start to think about, I wonder what I could do to help. Because if we now substitute fractions and math and just put engagement in there, it's very analogous to me to my daughter saying, Dad, I'm working on engagement. Well, it's so big, we don't even know where to start. And in fact, we don't even know how to help. But if someone said that we are specifically working on getting our kids to successfully start and complete tasks in the classroom, bang. Now, what that said to me is we've started to granularize one of the aspects that's important to us with engagement and how we can get to work with that. And that to me, whether it's engagement, safety, resilience, all these big, even literacy, numeracy, when we work with schools, when you and I work with schools, when they say that we're working on this specific aspect of literacy, this specific part of engagement, what it says to me is the school has really tried to dig into what that looks like. And safety is another one of those. We always say that we want to have our kids feel safe in our classrooms. And in some ways, I think you'd agree, Jimmy, safety doesn't pass the teenager test all that well because every one of us as educators, and me too, said, I do create a safe classroom environment. We all say that, of course we do. But I think if we take safety and start to think, but if we had a truly safe classroom environment, what would we observe from each student? Now, that's a different question. And one of the things we might observe is that each student is willing to try new things and share how it went, whether it was successful or unsuccessful. Because to me, that says I feel comfortable enough in the classroom, first of all, to try something new, but secondly, to come back and say, ugh, that didn't work all that well. Well, that might be one of those indicators because now we can start to say, hey, we're not just working on creating safe classrooms. We're actually working on getting each of our students to be able to share what they're doing, try things new, and be able to share afterwards how it went, whether it went well or not. That to me, going all the way back to the fractions piece, it's not working on safety. It's not working on math. It's getting right down to grain size because now when we say if we want each of our students to be able to try new things and share how it went and whether it went well or not, then I wonder what we need to do as educators and what would be the style of tasks and assessments in a classroom that would allow each of our students to feel safe. Because to me, Jimmy, whether it comes to the core principles, safety, resilience, the evidence of the work that we're doing in our classrooms is not just in our actions, because actions don't always lead to impact. It's what we want to see from kids. But until we're clear, coming back full circle to what you said at the start of the conversation, until all 8 of those groups are clear on what it is that we actually want to see, it's like hitting a moving target. And all words on the wall does is allows people to start to take that target and narrow it down in such a way that we can not only start to build that culture, but we can also start to build our efficacy in saying, when we provided students multiple opportunities and multiple modalities to be able to express their thoughts, ideas, and try new things, then we noticed more of our students were willing to try new things and be able to share how they went, whether they went well or not. Now we can connect our actions to the impact that's having in a classroom, and that's collective efficacy. So I think it really all comes together when we do this in words on the wall, but being very clear that we only provided examples of what it looks like because every school is in a different place on their trajectory, not only with their students, but as you said earlier, Jimmy, because we cause culture, it's where we are as adults. And I think that was one of the things that you and I were deliberate about, is being able to differentiate for where schools are at by giving them a framework as opposed to saying, this is what it should look like in your classroom. So that's to me where we can take those words like safety, resilience, all those things, and break them down into smaller, more manageable parts so that our teams, our schools, our leaders can actually feel like they're getting work done on them.
Wow. I was thinking about this word wow the other day and realized, wow, words on the wall. This is exactly, and I hope our audience has an opportunity to listen to you, Cale, at some point, because that is what you did to me in that first conversation that we had. You just wowed me. Like, I had not thought about it that way before. Of course, I love to talk about culture and love to talk about behavior of the adults, but the way you pushed my thinking and framed it up and said to me, but Jimmy, what would it actually look like, right? What would it lead to? And my friends, that is where the relationship began. It's a reminder again, at the end of the day, it's always about relationships, right? It's about the relationships that we have with the individuals in our classrooms, in our buildings, in our campuses. And at the end of the day, what we're asking ourselves is, well, do the behaviors of the adults in the organization mirror match the words on the wall? And we hope that you'll check out Words on the Wall. And if you're looking forward to or looking for opportunities to culturize your classroom or you're building your campus to excellence, where we can truly create a culture where every student and every adult feels like they belong and can truly make their impact, we hope you'll check out Words on the Wall. And if you're looking for someone to bring in to help your district or your staff, this is the guy. Cale Burke is the man. I promise you, he will not disappoint. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to listen to Cale and I. And we truly are grateful for the opportunity to spend a little time with you today. God bless, my friends. Continue on.